In the high country, when the frost still clung to the blades of grass and the pines whispered like ghosts of the past, a lone rider made his way up the slope. His horse moved slow, its breath rising in small clouds against the morning chill. Behind them trotted a black shepherd dog, its ears sharp, its gait steady as if it had long grown used to the silence of the mountains. The man rode with his hat pulled low, his coat stiff with dust, and his eyes fixed ahead on the narrow trail that led to a forgotten cabin near the edge of nowhere. Folks down in the valley hadn't seen him for months, maybe a year. Some said he'd gone mad after what happened. Others said he'd simply had enough of people. Whatever the truth was, the man had built his world out of solitude, and the wilderness had accepted him without question. He reached the cabin just as the sun spilled gold across the ridge. It was a small, time-worn thing, roof sagging, moss climbing its sides, and smoke long gone from its chimney. He dismounted slowly, the kind of slow that comes from years of pain you stop trying to hide. The dog ran ahead, sniffing the air, tail low, but wagging faintly as if glad to return. The man looked at the door, a door that creaked like it remembered everything. Inside lay the same table, the same chair, and the same hollow emptiness he'd left behind when he last walked out that night after the betrayal. The words still stung like it had a pulse of its own. Betrayed. It wasn't just a thing that happened. It was something that hollowed him out and left the shell standing. He lit the fire. Though he didn't feel the cold much anymore, the crackling. Wood filled the silence, and for the first time in a long while, he let his mind drift. Once this place had meant peace, a small refuge from the world's noise. He'd built it with his own hands, each log dragged up the slope, every board nailed under sunlight and sweat. Back then, he had someone who used to laugh here, someone who used to set flowers by the window and hum while cooking. But that was before trust had turned into a weapon, before words had turned to lies. Before the man who thought he knew everything about loyalty found himself left with nothing but the company of his dog, and the echo of what used to be, down below. The world kept moving. Ranchers traded cattle, trains passed through the plains, and new towns grew from the dust. But here, time felt stuck. Each sunrise only reminded him that he was still breathing, though he didn't quite know why. The dog, his only friend left, seemed to understand. It never asked for more than a kind word and a place near the fire. Sometimes, when the wind blew hard across the valley, the man talked to it like it was human. We did right by them, he'd mutter, eyes far away. Didn't deserve what came after. The dog would tilt its head, listening, as if it, too, carried the weight of a secret. That morning felt different, though. The forest seemed restless. The silence was heavier, and even the dog's ears twitched at sounds that weren't there before. The man went about his chores, chopping wood, checking the old fence, drawing. Water from the half-frozen stream, yet there was a stillness behind every sound. As the sun dipped lower, the dog wandered off toward the slope where the trees thickened. He called out, but the animal didn't return right away. Minutes passed, then an hour. A knot of worry formed in his chest, strange for a man who thought he'd lost the ability to feel much of anything. When the dog finally returned, its fur was ruffled, and its eyes were bright in a way that made him uneasy. It carried something in its mouth, not prey, not a bone, something pale and weathered, wrapped in cloth. The man crouched down, pried it gently from the animal's jaws, and froze when he saw what it was. The fabric was old but familiar, frayed at the edges, and stitched with the same pattern he'd once seen in her hands. His throat tightened as he unwrapped it. Inside lay a locket. Tarnished but unmistakable, the same locket he'd given her long ago when the stars still meant something. For a long while he just stared at it, as if time itself had stumbled back into his cabin. He arose, went outside, and scanned the tree line where the dog had come from. The light was fading, painting the woods in copper and shadow. The dog stood beside him, tail stiff, watching the same direction. Something was out there, maybe buried, maybe waiting. He closed his fingers around the locket and felt the weight of all the questions that had never been answered. The betrayal, the lies, the night she vanished without a trace. He had told. Himself he didn't care anymore that the past had burned itself out like an old campfire. But now the ashes stirred again. The night grew colder. He couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't alone, not entirely. The wind carried sounds that didn't belong to the forest, faint movements like someone walking far beyond sight. The dog's hackles rose, its low growl echoing softly through the pines. He reached for his rifle, more out of habit than fear, and waited. The stars crept out, one by one, indifferent to whatever played out beneath them. He thought of leaving, of heading down to the valley come morning, but his heart told him he'd only be running from something that had already found him. He went back inside, placed the locket on the table, and poured himself a drink from the bottle he kept for sleepless nights. The firelight danced across the walls, flickering over the scars on his hands, each one a story he'd rather forget. The dog lay near the door, eyes half open, body tense.
Outside, an owl cried, and silence again.
He tried to steady his breath to remind himself that ghosts don't come walking in the snow. The truth was, some ghosts don't need to walk. They live inside you, waiting for the right night to whisper again. Hours later, he woke to the dog barking wildly. The sound tore through the quiet like a warning. He stumbled to his feet, grabbed his lantern, and stepped out into the cold. The light swung across the clearing, over the rocks and frozen grass. The dog stood at the edge of the woods, barking at something unseen. The man followed its gaze, and then, in the faint glow, he saw it. A shape half hidden among the pines. It wasn't animal. It wasn't quite shadow either. For a moment, he thought it might be his mind playing tricks again, dragging the past into the present. But then the figure moved, slow and deliberate. As if it had been waiting for him all along. He froze, the locket cold against his chest where he had instinctively hung it again. The dog stopped barking, tail down, watching with quiet dread. The man took one hesitant step forward, heart pounding louder than the wind. The figure turned slightly, enough for the light to touch a face, or the ghost of one, and everything inside him broke open. The memory he'd buried so deep came. Rushing back with it, the promise by the river, the night of fire, the betrayal that had never been explained. Now, standing on that ridge beneath the stars, he realized the past wasn't finished with him yet. What his dog had found was only the beginning. The lantern flickered in his hand as he stared into the woods, the figure vanishing as quietly as it had appeared. The dog's low growl died to a whine, uncertain, as if it too didn't trust what its eyes had seen. The man stood there a long moment, the night wrapping around him like an old coat. He'd spent years trying to bury memories beneath work. Silence and whiskey butt now. The past had clawed its way back, wearing a face he wasn't ready to see again. When he finally turned back toward the cabin, his boots crunched over frost, and he could swear he heard another pair of footsteps following for just a second before the wind swallowed the sound. Inside, the fire had burned low. He shut the door, set the rifle against the wall, and sat by the table where the locket still lay. It gleamed faintly in the dim light, mocking him with the life it once represented. He remembered when he'd first given it to her by the creek behind the ranch years before everything went wrong. He had just come back from a cattle drive. That took weeks longer than expected. Dust on his skin, a wild hunger in his heart to see her again. She'd smiled that day, sunlight in her hair, and promised him she'd never leave, no matter how hard life turned. That was before the fire. Before the night that stole more than just his home. He leaned back, closed his eyes, and the past came alive again. He could see the ranch the way it used to be, a stretch of open land dotted with grazing horses. Fences still standing strong, and the smell of oak smoke drifting from the chimney. He'd built that ranch for her. Every plank, every fence post, every drop of sweat had been for a dream they shared. But dreams don't always die suddenly. Sometimes they rot slowly until all that's left is silence. It was the betrayal that killed him, not the loss itself. She hadn't just left. She had taken something far deeper, something that made him doubt every truth he ever believed in. The fire cracked, pulling him back to the present. The dog had settled near the door again, but its ears were still pricked, eyes on the window. He reached down and scratched behind its ear, the way he used to when thunder rolled over the plains. "You brought it back, didn't you?" he whispered. "Brought the past to my door." The dog only looked at him, tail twitching once before returning to stillness. He poured himself another drink, the burn of it chasing the chill from his chest. But no warmth could settle the unease inside him. He couldn't shake the feeling that the figure in the trees wasn't a dream. When dawn broke, the woods were heavy with fog. The man saddled his horse, pocketed the locket, and followed the trail the dog had taken the day before. The mist clung low to the ground, muting every sound, every hoofstep. The dog ran ahead again, nose close to the earth. The air smelled different now, earthy, faintly metallic, like rain that never came. After nearly an hour, they reached a clearing near the old creek bed. It was there the dog stopped, ears sharp, tail still. The man dismounted, boots sinking slightly in the damp soil. He followed the animal's gaze and saw it something half buried under fallen leaves, where the creek's bend met the roots of an old tree. He knelt, brushed the dirt away, and his breath caught. The remains of a wooden chest, small and broken by time, lay there. The metal clasps had rusted through, and the lid was half open, revealing fragments of fabric, old letters eaten by age, and a small silver ring he recognized at once. His heart pounded so loud it felt like thunder inside his chest. The ring was hers. He lifted it carefully, staring at the engraved initials inside his and hers, carved the day before they'd planned to wed. The ground beneath his knees suddenly felt colder. He looked around at the trees, the fog, the stillness, and whispered, "Why here?" He carried the chest back to the cabin, though each step felt heavier. Once inside, he spread the contents on the table what little time had spared. The letters were mostly unreadable, but one had survived enough to make out a few words. Words that changed the way he remembered everything. "They're coming. Don't trust them. If I don't make it, know that I tried." The handwriting was hers, trembling and rushed, like it had been written in fear. He read it again and again, trying to make sense of it. Could it be that she hadn't betrayed him at all? That what he thought was abandonment was something else entirely? He spent the rest of the day searching through the cabin, pulling out old belongings, maps, and tools from the past, hoping to find any other clue he might have missed. Outside, the dog circled the yard, restless and alert. By late afternoon, clouds gathered above the hills, turning the sky to steel. The man stepped out, feeling the wind pick up. Somewhere in the distance, a branch snapped too loud, too deliberate to be the wind. He turned, rifle in hand, scanning the trees. The dog growled again, low and deep. A shadow moved between the pines, quick as a breath, gone before he could draw a bead on it. He called out, voice rough, "Who's there?" The only reply was silence, followed by the echo of his own question. As night fell again, he barricaded the door. Though he knew wood and nails couldn't keep out what he feared most. He sat by the fire, staring into the flames, his thoughts a storm. Maybe it wasn't her ghost he'd seen. Maybe it was someone else, someone connected to that letter, someone who wanted the truth buried. The ranch had enemies once, greedy men who'd wanted the land, the water rights, everything he and she had built. Could one of them still be out there? He rubbed the ring between his fingers, feeling the worn engraving, and whispered, "What really happened to you?" The wind howled through the cracks of the cabin as if answering him. Sleep didn't come easy. When it did, it brought dreams of fire and shouting, of her face lit by the glow of flames, reaching for him across the smoke. He woke with sweat on his neck and the smell of ash in his mind. The dog was barking again, but this time softer, uncertain. He rose, heart pounding, and looked toward the window. A lantern light flickered outside, moving slowly down the slope. Someone was out there, and they were coming closer. He grabbed his coat and rifle, stepped out into the cold, and the wind snuffed the flame behind him. The light stopped near the creek. Through the haze, he saw a figure crouching beside the spot where he had dug up the chest. It wasn't the ghostly shape from the night before, it was someone solid. Wrapped in a long coat, a scarf hiding most of their face, the dog barked once, then went silent. The stranger turned, lantern raised, and for a brief moment, their eyes met. They were human, alive, but filled with something that made his skin tighten fear or guilt or both. "You shouldn't have found it," the stranger said quietly, voice trembling just enough to sound real. "It was meant to stay buried." The man froze, rifle still at his side, unsure if he was staring at an enemy or an answer. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice breaking through the cold air. The stranger hesitated, then looked toward the dark woods, as if expecting someone else to emerge. "It's not safe here," they whispered. "They're still watching." Then, before he could take a step forward, the lantern dropped, the light vanished, and the figure disappeared into the trees like smoke in the wind. The man stood alone by the creek again, the night swallowing every sound but the beating of his own heart. The dog whined softly, pressing close to his leg, eyes fixed on the woods. He knew this wasn't over. Whatever the truth was, it had been waiting for years, and now it had found him. As he walked back toward the cabin, snow began to fall in thin, silent flakes, covering the trail behind him. The past was no longer buried. It had come alive again, and he was standing in its shadow. The snow deepened overnight, blanketing the forest in silence. When the man woke, dawn had barely touched the sky, and the air inside the cabin felt colder than ever. The fire had died to embers. He sat for a long time, staring at the door, listening to the faint howl of wind seeping through the cracks. His mind kept circling back to that voice, the stranger's words replaying over and over. It was meant to stay buried. The tone hadn't been angry. It had been afraid. He'd seen fear before in the eyes of men before a gunfight, in horses before a storm, but this was something deeper, something desperate. Whoever that person was, they knew more than they said. He rose, fed the fire, and poured water into a pot. The dog stirred and came closer, eyes still fixed on the door as if expecting someone to knock. The man felt the same unease. He didn't believe in hauntings, not in the way old stories told it, but something about all this felt unnatural. It wasn't just the return of the past. It was the way the land itself seemed to hold its breath. He looked at the ring on the table and the half-burnt letters beside it. They were pieces of a puzzle he'd never wanted to solve. But now he couldn't turn away. The locket, the chest. The stranger, they were threads pulling him back to a truth that had been buried with her. After breakfast, decided to head into town. It had been months since he'd ridden down the valley road. And though he hated the thought of leaving his solitude, he needed answers. He saddled his horse, called the dog, and started toward the trail. The snow slowed them, but the familiar rhythm of hooves brought a strange calm. The world below was still the same old barns leaning with time, smoke curling from distant chimneys, the faint cries of hawks above. As he rode, he thought about the men who had once circled his life's neighbors, his ranchers, those who'd called themselves friends. Some had been loyal, others only until money or land came into question. And one among them, he suspected, had something to do with the betrayal that destroyed everything. By the time he reached the outskirts of the town, the sun hung low behind the clouds. A few wagons passed, men nodded as they recognized him, but didn't speak. His name still carried whispers, Harriman, once proud, now broken, living alone like a ghost. He tied his horse outside the saloon, but didn't go in. Instead, he crossed to the small post office, where an older man was sorting letters behind the counter. The postmaster looked up, surprised. "Well, I'll be damned. Didn't think I'd see you again."
Ah!
The rancher nodded once. "I'm looking for any letters sent to Mia maybe years back. Something I might have missed." The postmaster frowned, wiped his hands, and went to the back. A few minutes later, he returned with a small bundle, yellowed with age. These came months after. "The fire," he said quietly. "I figured you were gone. No one came to claim them." The rancher took the bundle, his hands tightening as he saw her handwriting. He didn't open them there. He thanked the man, mounted his horse, and turned back toward the hills. The dog ran close by, snow kicking up around its legs, halfway up the trail. The wind picked up, and the weight of those unopened letters burned in his pocket. By the time he reached the cabin, darkness had fallen again. He lit the fire, sat at the table, and opened the first one carefully. The ink was faded but still legible. "They want the land," it began. "They came again last night asking questions about the deed. I told them nothing. I think they're watching the house." The next line was smeared, but he could still make out her name at the bottom, written in haste. He read the next letter, then another. Each told fragments of fear warnings, unanswered questions, and a plan to leave before things turned violent. The last one stopped his breath cold. "If I don't make it, tell him I never betrayed him. I did what I had to so he could live." He sat there for a long time, the crackle of the fire breaking the silence. His hands trembled slightly, the words sinking deeper than any wound. Everything he'd believed about that night began to shift. The anger, the heartbreak, the years of guilt, it had all been built on a lie. She hadn't left him. She'd tried to save him. The thought struck harder than any betrayal ever could. The dog lifted its head suddenly, ears forward. A sound echoed outside, the crunch of snow, slow and deliberate. The man's hand went to his rifle. He stood, every muscle tense, and listened. The sound moved closer, then stopped near the window. He edged to the side, peering through the frost-coated glass. There was movement near the barn, a figure again, darker against the snow, waiting. He stepped outside, the cold biting through his coat. "Show yourself," he called, voice steady. A man stepped forward this time. Not the stranger from before, but someone older, broader, with a face marked by weather and years. His name came back to him after a moment. It was one of the ranchers who had once helped him fence his land. "You shouldn't have come back here," the visitor said, his tone low but sharp. "You stir things better left alone." The rancher lowered the rifle slightly, but didn't let go. "You know something about her?" The man's jaw tightened. "What I know won't change what's done. Let the dead rest." He took a step closer, eyes narrowing. "Rest? You think I can rest after what you did? After what you let happen?" The visitor's gaze flickered, and for a moment the mask slipped. "We had no choice. The land, the deal, it wasn't supposed to end like that. She got in the way. I tried to stop it." The words hung heavy in the air. Before he could speak again, the man turned, retreating into the snowstorm that had begun to rise. The rancher shouted after him, but the wind carried the sound away. The dog barked wildly, circling near the edge of the clearing. The figure was gone. Back inside, felt the anger return, not the blind rage from years ago, but something colder and sharper. He sat again, piecing together what he'd heard. The land, the deal, the threat, everything pointed to something buried deeper than he'd imagined. It hadn't been a crime of passion or betrayal. It was something darker, a plan that had gone wrong. He spent the next day combing through what little remained of his old documents, land deeds. Banknotes, letters. Patterns began to form. The land his ranch had stood on wasn't just another plot of dirt. It sat on the only spring-fed water source for miles. Back then, men had killed for less. He began to suspect that the fire wasn't an accident at all. As he worked, memories came flooding back, men riding up late at night, or whispering to him to stay quiet, the sound of horses pounding away into the dark. He remembered seeing her standing by the window that last night, holding something behind her back. He'd thought it was another letter, but now he wasn't sure. Maybe it had been proof, something she'd planned to hide before they came for her. When evening fell, the wind returned, stronger now, rattling the shutters. He looked toward the door and felt the old instinct again, danger close by. The dog was uneasy, pacing and whining softly. The smell of smoke touched the air, faint but real. He stepped outside, heart pounding. Down the hill, in the direction of the old barn, faint orange glow flickered against the snow. Fire. He ran, rifle slung over his shoulder, shouting for the dog to follow. The barn was already half consumed by flames, heat roaring in the icy wind. He tried to pull open the door, but the smoke drove him back. Through the crack he saw something, a lantern left burning, smashed against the straw. Someone had done this on purpose. He backed away, coughing, watching as the fire devoured what was left of his past. The horse screamed from the corral, terrified. He freed it, slapped its flank, and watched it bolt into the darkness. Then he turned toward the woods, where faint movement caught his eye. A figure again, watching from a distance before disappearing behind the trees. By the time the flames died, nothing remained but black ash and cold wind. He stood there, breath ragged, anger and sorrow twisting inside him. Whoever was out there wanted him gone. But this time, he wasn't running. The truth had been stolen once, but not again. He went back to the cabin, locked the door, and loaded his rifle. The dog curled near the fire, still trembling, but its eyes stayed open. The rancher sat by the window, staring into the forest where shadows moved like secrets. He knew the next step wouldn't come from waiting. He'd have to go back to the place where it all began, to the ruins of the old ranch. Somewhere out there lay the proof she'd died for. And until he found it, there'd be no peace. Not for her, not for him. And not for the ghosts that walked these hills when the wind turned cold. The next morning broke cold and pale. The sky hung heavy, swollen with clouds that threatened more snow. The man stood outside the cabin, watching the last traces of smoke curl up from the burned barn. The air smelled of wet ash and regret. His hands were steady now, the shock replaced by purpose. He knew what he had to do. The fire wasn't meant to destroy, it was meant to warn. Someone wanted him out of these mountains before he uncovered the truth. But the land, the locket, the letters, and the ring had given him enough to know that leaving was no longer an option. He saddled his horse, strapped the rifle across his back, and called to the dog. They set out toward the ruins of the old ranch, where everything had begun, and where it seemed everything would end. The trail wound through the pines, half buried in snow. Every step forward felt like walking deeper into his own past. The closer he got, the heavier the silence became. He hadn't been back since that night, the night when flames had turned his world to dust. The wind howled through the trees as he approached the clearing. The old ranch lay in ruins, the remains of its stone foundation, peeking through patches of snow and weeds. Time had buried much of it, but he could still see the outline of the barn, the corral, the big oak, where she used to hang a lantern when he rode home late. He dismounted slowly, running a gloved hand over the charred stones as memories came flooding back. The dog barked once and ran ahead, nose low, circling near what used to be the porch. The man followed, crouching as he noticed something glint beneath the snow. It was a small metal box, scorched but intact. He pried it open carefully. Inside were more letters, tied together with a strip of faded fabric and a small wrapped piece of parchment. His heart thudded. The writing was hers again. He unfolded the parchment and a map fell out hand-drawn, marked with a symbol he recognized. It was the creek, the one behind the ranch, with a red cross drawn near a cliffside. Beneath the map, the words were scrawled. "If anything happens to me, follow this." He looked toward the ridge where the creek would be, now buried under snow. The air felt different there, like the woods themselves were waiting. He packed the map, whistled for the dog, and headed in that direction. The horse snorted, uneasy as if it sensed something unseen. The trail narrowed between rocks, winding down toward a frozen stream. The dog stopped again, growling low. The man scanned the area and spotted boot prints, fresh ones leading toward the same direction as the mark on the map. Someone else was looking for it. He moved carefully, following the tracks. They led up toward the cliffside, where the earth jutted out in uneven ledges. Halfway there, he heard the faint echo of voices. He crouched behind a fallen log, peering through the snow-dusted brush. Two men stood near the base of the cliff, shovels in hand, talking in hushed tones. He recognized one of them, the same broad-shouldered rancher who had come to warn him to let the dead rest. The other was younger, rough-faced, with a revolver strapped to his hip. They were digging for something. He tightened his grip on the rifle, heart hammering. So this was it. Whatever they'd done to her, whatever they'd hidden, it was buried here. He stayed low, waiting, watching as the older man wiped sweat from his brow and said, "We can't let him find it. If he does, everything we built is gone." The younger one nodded, shoveling faster. "What if he's already on his way?" The older man's face hardened. "Then we finish before he gets here. We burn it all like before." Elle's words hit him like a blade. Burn it all. Just like the ranch, just like her. Rage and sorrow twisted together in his chest, but he forced himself to stay quiet. He had one chance to uncover what they'd hidden and maybe the proof she'd died protecting. He moved along the ridge above them, keeping to the trees until he found a vantage point. From there, he saw the glint of metal, half buried, where they were digging a tin lockbox, old and rusted. The men had nearly unearthed it when the dog barked suddenly from below, giving away his position. Both men spun around, guns raised. The older one shouted, "Who's there?" The dog growled, standing its ground, while the rancher aimed his rifle. A shot rang out, striking the snow inches from his feet. The echo rolled through the valley like thunder. He fired back, the bullet splintering a nearby tree. The younger man scrambled for cover, while the older cursed, dragging the lockbox toward him. The dog charged, knocking the younger man off balance, and the rancher seized the moment, sliding down the slope. The older man drew his revolver, firing wildly, one shot grazing the rancher's shoulder. Pain burned through him, but he kept moving, slamming into the man with a force that sent both of them sprawling. The revolver skidded across the ground. They struggled in the snow, fists in fury, years of betrayal pouring into every strike. "You killed her," the rancher roared, voice breaking. "You burned everything." The older man's face twisted with guilt and anger. "You think I wanted that?" She wouldn't give it up. She said she'd rather die than sign the land away. The younger man scrambled for the revolver again, but the dog lunged, knocking it from his grip. The rancher saw his chance. He pinned the older man down, hand closing over his collar. "What was in that box?" he demanded. The man's breath came ragged, eyes darting to the metal case half buried in snow. "Proof," he gasped. "Deed's letter she had it all. They wanted her gone so she couldn't expose them. I tried to warn her." His voice cracked then, eyes wet with a guilt that no years could wash away, before the rancher could speak again. The younger one pulled a knife, lunging forward. The rancher rolled aside just in time, the blade slicing through his coat. He swung the rifle's butt, striking the man hard enough to send him down. The dog barked, snapping at his arm until he dropped the knife. The older man scrambled to his knees, trying to flee, but the rancher fired into the air. "Don't move," he said coldly. "Not another step." The wind tore through the clearing, carrying their breath in white plumes. Snow fell heavier now, cloaking everything in ghostly light. The older man's shoulders sagged. "It's too late," he muttered. "They'll come for you next. You can't stop them." "Who?" the rancher demanded. "The ones who took the land. The ones who made me burn your ranch. They own half this valley now, and they'll kill anyone who threatens that." The words sank in, heavy as stone. The rancher didn't lower the rifle. He moved to the box, pried it open, and froze. Inside were sealed papers, a ring identical to his own, and a final letter, her handwriting again, faded but still clear. He could barely read the first line before his throat tightened. "If you ever find this, it means I failed to protect what we built. But at least you'll know the truth." He looked up, anger and grief mixing into something fierce and unbreakable. "You said she got in the way," he said quietly. "But you were the one who set the fire." The man didn't answer. His silence was confession enough. Lightning flashed in the distance, thunder rolling behind the mountains. The storm was closing in fast. The rancher took the box and backed away, rifle still trained on them. "You'll answer for it," he said, voice steady despite the cold. The older man just shook his head, muttering, "You don't understand. They never left." Then, before the rancher could react, the man turned and disappeared into the trees, his partner stumbling after him. The rancher didn't follow. He knelt beside the open box, snow falling into it, melting on the ink. The dog whined softly, pressing its head against his arm. He closed the lid, stood, and looked toward the distant lights of the valley. He knew what had to be done now. The papers, the proof, they were the key to everything. To clearing her name, to reclaiming what had been stolen, to finally ending this. As he mounted his horse, the wind howled louder, carrying the smell of smoke again, from the barn this time, but from somewhere beyond the ridge. He turned, eyes narrowing. Flames flickered faintly in the distance. Maybe a campfire, maybe something worse. The dog barked, eager, ready. The rancher gripped the reins. "We ride," he said quietly, voice filled with purpose. "We finish what she started." The storm broke open as they rode into the dark, snow whipping against his face. Firelight glowing like a signal in the valley below. The truth was no longer buried, and though he didn't yet know what waited beyond that light, he could feel that the end of the road was near, and for the first time in years, it carried a faint promise of hope. The storm chased him through the valley that night. Snow swirling in wild circles, as if the land itself wanted to bury every secret before dawn. But the rancher didn't slow down. The horse's hooves pounded through the white ground, each breath of the animal forming ghosts in the wind. The dog kept pace beside them, barking sharply whenever the wind howled too loud. The box was strapped tight behind him, the weight of it pressing against his back like the heartbeat of the truth he'd been chasing for years. He rode toward the faint glow he'd seen before, the fire flickering against the horizon. It wasn't a campfire anymore. The glow had grown brighter, stretching into the sky like a signal calling him home. By the time he reached the edge of the ridge, the snow had turned to sleet. Down below, nestled between the trees, burned the remains of an old cabin. It wasn't his, but it looked the same rough timber, same lonely smoke curling into the storm. He dismounted and walked toward it, rifle in hand, boots sinking deep into the melting snow. The dog followed, growling low. He could hear voices, angry, desperate, and close. He moved closer until he could see through the storm's veil. 2 figures stood by the flames. One of them was the older man from before, shouting at someone unseen inside the cabin. "You think you can hide it forever?" He barked. He knows now. It's over. Then came another voice, steady, quiet, a woman's voice. The rancher froze. It couldn't be. The sound cut through him like sunlight through shadow. The old man cursed again, kicked the door open, and dragged someone out. The rancher saw her clearly now, a woman, older than he remembered, but with the same hair, the same face that had haunted his dreams. For a heartbeat, he couldn't move. It didn't make sense. She was supposed to be gone, buried, lost in the fire that night. Yet there she stood, bound, her eyes wide with shock when she saw him at the edge of the clearing. He stepped forward, rifle steady, voice breaking through the storm. "Let her go." The old man spun around, startled, his expression flickering between guilt and fury. "You don't understand," he said. "She's the reason all this started." The rancher didn't listen. He moved closer, boots crunching through snow, the rifle aimed at the man's chest. "I said let her go." The younger accomplice, the one from the creek, appeared behind the old man, drawing his revolver. Before he could aim, the dog lunged, knocking him down into the snow. The gun went off, the shot tearing into the air. The rancher fired once in return, the bullet striking the ground near the older man's feet. "Enough," the rancher said. "This ends here." The wind roared through the trees, carrying his words like a final warning. The old man's hand trembled as he dropped his weapon. "She was supposed to stay dead," he muttered. "They made me believe she was gone." The woman's voice broke through then, tired but strong. "You lied to everyone. You burned the ranch to cover their greed." The rancher's gaze flicked between them, his heart hammering. "Tell me," he said to her, "was it all true? The letters, the locket, did you write them?" She nodded slowly, tears glinting in the firelight. "I tried to warn you," she said softly. "They came for the land, for the spring beneath it. When I refused to sign, they threatened your life. I thought if I disappeared, they'd leave you alone. He helped me fake my death, but they turned on him too. I've been hiding ever since." Her words came with the weight of years, but also a strange relief. The truth, buried under ashes and lies, was finally standing in the open. The old man fell to his knees, his face pale. "I did what I was told," he said, "but I couldn't carry it anymore." He looked up, defeated. "They'll come after you now. Both of you." The rancher shook his head. "No, they won't." He took the lockbox from his saddlebag and opened it. The papers inside, still safe under layers of cloth, held everything: the deeds, the forged contracts, the evidence of the men who had stolen his land and her peace. "This is enough to end them," he said, "once and for all." Thunder cracked in the distance as if to mark the moment. The woman turned to him, her eyes searching his face. "You came back," she whispered. He almost smiled. "I never really left. Just didn't know what I was looking for until now." By morning, the storm had passed. The sky cleared into a pale stretch of blue, sunlight spilling over the snow. The fire had died down to smoldering ashes, and the valley below glowed golden under the dawn. The rancher and the woman rode together toward town, the dog trotting alongside, their tracks cutting a single trail through the snow. The lockbox rested between them, heavy with proof, but lighter than the burden he'd carried for years. Neither spoke much during the ride, but every now and then their eyes met, sharing quiet understanding, the kind that doesn't need words. When they reached the town, people stopped to stare. The rancher hadn't been seen here in years, and now he rode in with the woman everyone thought dead. He went straight to the sheriff's office. Inside, the warmth of the stove fought against the lingering chill. He set the box on the desk. "Everything you need is in there," he said simply. The sheriff opened it, eyes widening as he read through the papers. "Well," he said, looking up, "seems like justice just thawed out of the snow. Took days for the truth to spread." The names of the men who had taken the land were exposed, their titles stripped, their influence broken. The rancher's land was restored to him, though he no longer cared much for the property itself. What mattered was the peace that came with truth. The valley, once tainted by betrayal, began to heal. People who had whispered about him in the past now tipped their hats with quiet respect when he rode through town. He rebuilt the ranch not as it once was, but better. The walls stood stronger, the roof new, the hearth burning bright again. The woman stayed with him, helping rebuild every corner, her laughter returning like music to the empty hills. The dog guarded the place faithfully, resting by the porch each evening as the sun dipped low behind the mountains. Sometimes, when the wind blew across the plains, the rancher would stop his work and look toward the ridge where the fire had once burned. He'd think of the years he'd lost to anger and silence, and of how the truth had waited for him all along. The pain had changed him, but it had also carved room for something new hope. One evening, as the last light faded and the sky turned gold, the woman stood beside him on the porch. "You never asked me why I stayed away so long," she said quietly. He smiled faintly. "Didn't have to. The past doesn't need an apology when the future's still waiting." She took his hand, their fingers intertwining as the wind carried the scent of pine and smoke. The seasons turned after that. Spring brought life back to the land, grass rising where ash once lay, birds nesting in the rafters of the barn. Travelers passing through the valley often stopped to rest by the creek, telling stories of a rancher who once lost everything but found it again through truth and forgiveness. They'd point to the cabin on the hill and say that's where it happened, where love returned, where peace grew again from the burned soil. Years later, the man would still wake sometimes to the sound of wind against the windows, half expecting the ghosts of the past to return, but they never did. The land was quiet now, the kind of quiet that came not from loneliness, but from contentment. The dog, older and slower, still followed him to the creek each morning, tail wagging. He'd toss a stick into the water and watch it drift away, smiling faintly at how time had carried him just the same away from pain, toward something whole again. As the sun set behind the mountains, casting long shadows over the fields, he stood with the woman by his side and watched the light fade gently over the land they had both fought for. The fire that once destroyed everything had also forged something stronger. He understood that now. Some things must burn before they can grow again. And in that stillness, as the dog lay near their feet and the ranch glowed warm behind them, the man finally felt at the peace he'd been chasing all his life. The valley had kept its promise. The past had given way to the present. And love, quiet and enduring, had come home at last.